My name's Aaron Massey from MrFixItDIY.com and welcome back to another episode of Homeschool. In this episode, I'm going to be sharing 10 tiling tips that will hopefully make your next DIY tile project go a lot smoother. Number one is to make sure you have the right tools on hand. To get a quality installation with your tile, you're gonna need some basic tools to get started. I recommend that you have a hammer, pencil, a level, a drill and a paddle mixer for mixing mortar, various notch trowels, a rubber grout float and a sponge, some knee pads, a bucket, and a way to cut the tile. Now, a wet tile saw or a tile score and snap tool is really useful, especially if you're doing a larger tile project. However, if you can't find one or you can't rent one, you can also use an angle grinder with a diamond cutoff blade or a small saw like this one with a diamond cutoff blade. A pair of tile nippers like these ones can also be very helpful for small cuts. My friends at Kobalt Tools hooked me up with a bunch of tools to test out, so I'll be putting them to the test in much of the footage you'll see in this video. So I wanted to say a quick thank you to Kobalt Tools for sending them over to me to test out. Number two is to make sure your subfloor is flat and level. When doing a tile floor project, you'll want to make sure your floor is flat and level. You can use either a cement backer board or what's called a dry pack mortar bed to set your tile on. A backer board application is a lot more DIY friendly, but you're also kind of limited to what the floor underneath it is doing. A lot of professional tile setters like to use their own dry pack mortar bed, which allows you to level uneven surfaces. You can also use a self-leveling product to adjust your subfloor first and then apply a backer board or other membrane to tile over. You never want to tile directly over wood, as wood expands and contracts in moisture and then in different seasons, and it can cause your tile and your grout to crack. Number three is to know the difference between mastic and thin-set mortar and when to use each. Now, there are two main categories of adhesive to choose from when installing tile. Number one is called mastic, and it's commonly sold in stores as tile adhesive. Mastic is a premixed glue-like product and should only be used in primarily dry applications like kitchen backsplashes. Mastic is stickier than mortar, so it's good for vertical wall applications that aren't exposed to regular moisture. When installing a backsplash with mastic, I'll use a 3/16 or 5/32 notch trowel to apply mastic to the wall in small working areas, and then press the tile in place on the wall, and then press it in place with a grout float to make sure that it's pressed in properly. The notches in the trowel help secure the tile and make sure you aren't over applying too much mastic, which will squeeze out and cause problems with grouting, especially if you're using small mosaic tiles like these. Thin-set mortar, on the other hand, can be used in any application and is my primary method for tile installation. Thin-set is sold in bags or boxes and is mixed with water to create a peanut butter-like paste. I use thin-set for all flooring applications, shower and bath enclosures, and any large format tile installs. When applying your mortar or adhesive to the floor or walls, keep your notches running in one direction and make sure that your notches are full. That is to say, you don't have any of these little spotty looking lines. Speaking of lines, number four is to use layout lines. In older homes, sometimes rooms aren't really square, and it can be difficult to determine how the tile will look when installed. I like to always reference the longest wall in the room and draw a line down the middle of the room. I usually add at least one perpendicular line as well. I reference these lines throughout the install to make sure that my courses are always running straight. Now, depending how square or out of square the room is, you can also use the Pythagorean theorem, or what's called the 3-4-5 rule, to create square lines in the room. Number five, setting your first course is most important. Now, everything after the first course references what the first course is doing. That's why it's the most important. You can roughly lay out tiles in the room to make sure you won't have sliver cuts at the end as well. I typically like to shift the tile layout so that I have roughly a half tile at each wall. Laying out your tile setup in something like SketchUp can also help you determine how to best set your first course. I always like to hide cuts as much as possible outside of the primary eye line, so keeping them along the edges of the room is best. Number six is back buttering large format tile. A large format tile is considered anything that's larger than 12 by 12 inches. When installing a larger tile like this, it's important to do a technique called back buttering. Back buttering involves adding a thin coat of thin-set to the back side of your tile using the flat side of the trowel. When pressing down into the notches of the mortar on the floor or the wall, this will create a full seat for the tile and not allow for air gaps to be created underneath, which can lead to cracks or breaks in the tile later on if something's dropped on it. Now there's a lot of back and forth that goes on about back buttering smaller tiles, but in most small tile applications like subway tiles, you likely don't need to back butter the tiles. Number 7 is to trim your door casing. Now you can almost always tell a professional tile job from a DIY tile job in a few ways. Number 1, the most common DIY mistake I see is how people handle cuts around door jambs and frames. Many times people elect to cut around the door casing, which can look okay if you do it really well, but you've also now encased the door casing, so if you ever want to change it, you'll have to cut it off at the tile anyway. The proper way to do it is to use an oscillating tool to cut off the casing so you can slide the tile underneath it. It gives you a clean finish and also will allow you to change the casing easily later on if you choose to. Now the other most common mistake I see is uneven tiles, which leads me to my next point, which is number 8, use tile leveling spacers to minimize lippage. Tiling's an imperfect science. There are a lot of variables to getting it to look right. Small changes in the amount of mortar, a floor that isn't flat, or a random loose stone in your mortar can all affect how the tile sets. I recommend using tile leveling spacers to minimize lippage as much as possible. Lippage is when one tile is proud of the other tile, which can easily be seen with the eye or felt underfoot. Leveling spacers can help even out any imperfections. Number 9 is to use an angle grinder to create radius or plunge cuts. Cutting radius cuts or cuts in the middle of a tile for something like a receptacle can be a little bit tricky. I like to use an angle grinder with a diamond cutoff wheel to make those cuts. Now another option for small cuts around the edges of tile is to score lines in the tile and use tile nippers to follow the contours. And lastly, choose the right grout. Choosing the right grout is as important as choosing the right tile. When choosing a grout, there are 3 typical types to choose from. Number 1 is sanded grout. Sanded grout is a grout that contains larger aggregate sand that is used for larger spacing applications greater than 1/8 of an inch. So if you're using a tile spacer that's say 1/4 of an inch in your project, you want to make sure that you use a sanded grout for your application. Now non-sanded grout, on the other hand, is a finer grout, and it's used for tile applications where the spacing between the tiles is less than 1/8 of an inch. Now with either sanded or non-sanded grout, you want to make sure you seal the grout with a grout sealant to keep out dirt and grime. Unlike sanded and non-sanded grout, which are cement-based, epoxy grout is epoxy-based, which makes it very durable, waterproof, and resistant to cracks and staining. However, the application process is a little more challenging, it's higher cost, and it has more of a plastic-looking appearance. In most flooring applications, I always like to choose a grout that is as close to the floor tile as possible to minimize the discrepancies that can be created from dirt and grime and walking on it over time. But that's just my personal preference. To install sanded or non-sanded grout, you mix it like you would mortar, but slightly more watery, and then spread it across the tile application with a rubber float. After it hazes over for about 30 minutes, use a sponge to wipe off any excess and to clean the tiles. You'll probably have to clean the floor several times to get rid of all the haze. I personally like to use a disposable head mop to save my back and knees as much as possible. So that's it for this episode. I hope you guys liked it. I hope you learned something. Most importantly, I hope it gave you a tip or two that might be helpful for you when you tackle your next tiling project around your house. Thanks again to Kobalt Tools for providing many of the tools that you saw me use in this episode, and I encourage you guys to check them out at your local Lowe's home improvement stores. You can also find my more thorough review of each of these tools under the review tabs on my website. As always, if you did like this video, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to leave me a question or comment down below. And don't forget that you can find all my DIY home improvement projects, tips and tricks, and downloadable project plans on my website at mrfixitdiy.com. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.